Martha Simmons, a rich icon, throws hot coffee and harsh words at a black waitress who's simply doing her job. But seconds later, karma destroys her reputation in an instant, forcing her to confront consequences she never saw coming. Will she find redemption, or has her reckoning just begun? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Martha Simmons stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the marble countertop. The morning sun streamed through the mansion's windows, but it did nothing to brighten her darkening mood. "Where is everyone?" she muttered, checking her diamond-studded watch for the third time. Her phone buzzed, and she snatched it up, her jaw tightening as she read the message. "Just wonderful," she said through gritted teeth. Her assistant, Amy, had canceled their morning meeting due to a family emergency. Martha didn't care about the reason. She only cared that her carefully planned schedule was now in shambles. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Usually by now, her team would be bustling around, making sure everything was perfect for Hollywood's Golden Heart. That's what the magazines called her, after all. 20 years of charitable work and carefully crafted public appearances had earned her that title. When her stylist finally arrived 45 minutes late, Martha didn't bother hiding her irritation. "Traffic was terrible," the young woman explained, looking flustered. "Traffic is always terrible in Los Angeles," Martha snapped. "That's why normal people plan ahead." She saw the stylist's face fall, but she couldn't bring herself to care. The girl should know better. Things went from bad to worse when she tried on the designer dress for her afternoon charity event. The zipper caught halfway up, and then split with a horrible ripping sound. "This is completely unacceptable," Martha's voice echoed off the walls of her massive walk-in closet. "Do you have any idea how much this dress cost? Or how important today's event is?" The stylist's hands trembled as she examined the tier. "I can fix this, Ms. Simmons. Or we can select another dress." "Another dress?" Martha laughed, but there was no warmth in it. This dress was specifically chosen to match the event's theme. The press will be there. The photos will be everywhere. She ran her fingers through her perfectly styled hair, not caring that she was ruining an hour's worth of work. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, another problem. The caterer for her upcoming charity gala needed to reschedule their tasting appointment. Martha felt her blood pressure rising. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, her face flushed with anger, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. This wasn't the serene, compassionate woman whose photo graced the covers of magazines. This wasn't the Martha Simmons who made touching speeches about helping others and brought tears to people's eyes with her generous donations. But right now, she didn't care. She was tired of smiling, tired of being perfect, tired of maintaining the image that had taken decades to build. She just wanted one day, just one day, where everything went according to plan. "Get out," she said quietly to her stylist. "Just get out. All of you, leave me alone." Hours later, Martha's silver Mercedes glided to a stop in front of the Morning Light Cafe, a quaint little place she'd never normally visit. The brick building with its cheerful blue awning looked welcoming enough, and right now she needed somewhere, anywhere, to escape and regroup. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and grabbed her designer handbag. Even in her distressed state, Martha moved with the practiced grace of someone used to being watched. Several heads turned as she entered, the little bell above the door announcing her arrival. The cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, filled with the clinking of cups and the gentle hum of conversation. The aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, but Martha barely noticed. All she could focus on was how this day kept spiraling further out of her control. A few patrons whispered and pointed, their faces lighting up with recognition. One young woman fumbled for her phone, probably hoping to snap a picture. Martha turned away sharply, her lips pressed into a tight line. She wasn't in the mood to play the role of beloved celebrity today. Behind the counter, Grace Daniels managed the rush with calm efficiency, her warm smile never wavering as she handled multiple orders. Her dark curls were neatly pulled back, and her white apron was spotless despite the busy shift. She moved with purpose, making each customer feel valued and welcomed. "I'll be right with you, ma'am," Grace called out to Martha, her voice gentle and sincere. Martha's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together. Being made to wait wasn't part of her plan. She drummed her fingers on the counter, watching as Grace finished preparing another customer's order. The waitress took her time, carefully adding whipped cream to a hot chocolate and exchanging a few kind words with an elderly gentleman. When Grace finally turned to her, that same genuine smile still in place, Martha barely made eye contact. "I need a large soy latte, extra hot, sugar-free vanilla," she said curtly, not bothering with a greeting. "And please make it quick. Some of us have important meetings to get to." "Of course," Grace replied, maintaining her professional warmth despite Martha's cold demeanor. "Would you like to try our fresh-baked scones? They're still warm from the oven." "Just the latte," Martha replied, already pulling out her phone to check her messages. She could feel more eyes on her, more whispers, more phones being raised. Usually she'd turn and give them her practiced smile, the one that had graced countless magazine covers. But not today. Today, she just wanted her coffee and escape. Grace began preparing the drink with careful attention to detail, while Martha stood rigid and impatient, her heel tapping against the hardwood floor. The whole cafe scene, with its mismatched chairs and local artwork on the walls, felt beneath her. She should have sent someone to fetch her coffee instead of coming herself. Martha chose a small table near the window, dropping her designer bag onto an empty chair with a huff. From her vantage point, she could see Grace moving between tables, refilling water glasses, and delivering plates of food. Each minute that passed felt like an eternity to Martha. She watched as Grace paused to help a young mother settle her children, even taking time to wipe up a small juice spill. Martha's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the wooden table surface. Surely Grace knew who she was, everyone did, so why wasn't she getting preferential treatment? "This is ridiculous," Martha muttered under her breath, checking her watch for the third time in 2 minutes. A couple at the next table glanced her way, then quickly looked down at their plates. When Grace finally approached with the steaming cup, Martha didn't bother to hide her annoyance. "I hope this was worth the wait," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Grace set the cup down carefully. "I apologize for the delay, ma'am. I made sure to follow your specifications exactly." Martha lifted the cup to her lips, took a small sip, and immediately wrinkled her nose in disgust. "This is barely lukewarm," she announced, her voice carrying across the cafe. "And where's the vanilla? I can't taste any vanilla at all." She pushed the cup away as if it had personally offended her. The cafe grew quieter. A teenage girl 2 tables over pulled out her phone, pointing it discreetly in Martha's direction. An elderly couple exchanged disappointed looks. Someone whispered, "Is that really Martha Simmons? The one who's always on TV talking about kindness?" "I can make you a fresh cup right away," Grace offered, maintaining her composure. "Don't bother," Martha snapped. "I asked for extra hot and you couldn't even manage that basic request. Isn't making coffee your job?" More whispers rippled through the cafe. A man in a business suit shook his head disapprovingly. 2 women at the counter leaned close together, speaking in hushed tones while casting sideways glances at Martha. "Did you see how she just spoke to Grace? And Grace is always so nice to everyone. I thought Martha Simmons was supposed to be different." The murmurs grew, and though Martha could hear them, she chose to ignore them, instead fixing Grace with a cold stare. Her morning had been difficult enough without having to deal with subpar service in a second-rate cafe. Martha's frustration reached its boiling point. Her perfectly lined lips twisted into a snarl as she gripped the coffee cup tightly, her knuckles turning white against the ceramic. The whispers around her seemed to grow louder, piercing through her carefully maintained composure. "Is this how you treat all your customers?" Martha's voice rose sharply. "Or just the ones who expect basic competence?" Grace remained calm, though her eyes reflected hurt at the harsh words. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to—" But Martha had reached her limit. In one swift, angry motion, she flung the cup and its contents directly at Grace. The coffee splashed across Grace's crisp white uniform, and she let out a small cry of pain as the liquid burned her arm. The cup clattered to the floor, breaking into pieces. The entire cafe fell into a shocked silence. Forks stopped mid-bite. Conversations died mid-sentence. The only sound was the soft drip of coffee from Grace's soaked uniform onto the floor. Grace stood perfectly still, coffee streaming down her front, her right arm already showing signs of redness where the hot liquid had made contact. Her eyes welled with tears, not from anger, but from the sting of the burn and the public humiliation. Martha rose from her seat, gathering her designer bag. She didn't even look at Grace as she stepped around the growing puddle of coffee on the floor. In her mind, this was justified, a proper response to poor service and disrespect. She held her head high, her heels clicking against the tile floor as she made her way to the exit. The other patrons sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Several phones were now raised, recording the aftermath of Martha's outburst. The teenage girl who had been filming earlier had captured the whole incident. "Hey!" Martha pushed through the door, letting it slam behind her. The sound seemed to echo through the still silent cafe, a final punctuation mark to her dramatic exit. As Martha's heels clicked down the sidewalk outside the cafe, inside, dozens of fingers were already tapping away at their phones. Jenny Martinez, a college student who had been studying in the corner, had captured the entire incident in crystal-clear video. Her hands trembled as she pressed the upload button on her social media account. "I can't believe what I just saw," she whispered to her friend across the table. "That was Martha Simmons, right? The one who's always talking about kindness and charity?" Within minutes, the video began its journey across the internet. The caption read, "Hollywood's golden heart, Martha Simmons attacks innocent waitress with hot coffee. This is how she treats people in real life." The first comment started rolling in immediately. "Is this for real? I thought she was supposed to be nice. This is disgusting behavior. That poor waitress, someone needs to help her." The video spread like wildfire. Other patrons who had recorded the incident from different angles began sharing their footage too. Each new angle showed Martha's cruel behavior in stark detail. Her twisted expression, the force with which she threw the coffee, and Grace's dignified composure even in the face of such humiliation. News websites started picking up the story. Entertainment blogs began sharing the footage. Within 30 minutes, hashtag Martha Simmons was trending, accompanied by hashtags Fake Golden Heart and Justice for Grace. Back in the cafe, several customers had gathered around Grace, offering napkins and support. An older woman named Betty, a regular at the cafe, held Grace's burned arm under cool running water in the kitchen. "My daughter works in media," Betty said, looking at her phone. "She says the video's already got over 50,000 views and it's only been up for 20 minutes. Grace seemed overwhelmed by all the attention. "I never wanted to cause trouble," she said softly, wincing as Betty gently patted her arm dry. "You didn't cause anything, dear," Betty assured her. "That woman did this to herself." Outside the cafe, people were already slowing down to peer through the windows, having recognized the location from the viral video. Some had their phones out, taking pictures of the storefront. Local news vans were beginning to arrive, their reporters setting up equipment on the sidewalk. The contrast between Martha's carefully cultivated public image and her actual behavior had struck a chord with people. Comments continued to pour in by the thousands, each expressing shock and disappointment at seeing their beloved Golden Heart actress reveal such a dark side. Martha's day continued as planned, her thoughts barely lingering on the cafe incident as she prepared for the evening's charity gala benefiting children's education. Her stylist had managed to create the perfect look, a flowing champagne-colored gown that sparkled under the ballroom lights of the Beverly Hills Hotel. She swept into the event fashionably late, pausing for photographers who called her name. "Martha, over here! Give us that golden heart smile." The cameras flashed as she offered her practiced, radiant expression. Inside the ballroom, something felt off. The usual warmth that greeted her at these events seemed muted. Several guests who normally rushed to embrace her merely nodded from a distance. Martha attributed it to everyone being preoccupied with their phones. An unusual number of people seemed to be glancing at their screens while throwing furtive looks her way. Martha, darling, cooed Regina Wallace, a fellow actress known for her sharp tongue. I always said you were quite the performer, though I must say your performance today was particularly memorable. She sipped her champagne with a knowing smirk. Martha's brow furrowed slightly. I'm not sure what you mean, Regina. Oh, nothing, dear. Just that some roles are more convincing than others. Regina glided away, leaving Martha puzzled. Throughout the evening, similar cryptic comments followed her. I had no idea you felt so strongly about coffee, one board member remarked with raised eyebrows. Another guest asked if she'd tried the coffee at the gala, adding, I assure you it's served at the perfect temperature. Even the event's host, Thomas Bradford, seemed cool during his usual greeting. Martha, I've always admired how you treat everyone with equal respect, he said, his voice carrying an edge. It's so important for public figures to maintain consistent behavior, wouldn't you agree? Martha dismissed these interactions as petty jealousy or meaningless chatter. She continued working the room, though she noticed fewer people seeking her attention than usual. Some even seemed to step away as she approached. Did you hear about what happened at that little cafe? She overheard someone whisper. I saw the video, another replied. I can't believe it's the same person. Martha straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin higher. These people were clearly spreading baseless gossip, something she was used to after decades in Hollywood. She took another champagne flute from a passing waiter, barely glancing at him, and focused on maintaining her composure. After all, she was Martha Simmons, Hollywood's golden heart. A little idle gossip couldn't touch her reputation. What she didn't notice was that even the serving staff were watching her warily, having seen the viral video of their fellow service worker being assaulted with hot coffee just hours before. The next morning, Martha's peaceful slumber was shattered by the incessant buzzing of her phone. Squinting at the screen, she saw dozens of missed calls from her publicist Janet and her manager David. Text messages flooded in faster than she could read them. Turn on the news now. Crisis meeting needed ASAP. Have you seen what's happening? Martha's stomach tightened as she opened her laptop. Her hands trembled as she typed her name into the search bar. The screen filled with headlines that made her blood run cold. Hollywood's golden heart shows true colors, Martha Simmons assaults waitress. Viral video shows Martha Simmons throwing coffee at cafe worker. The fall of Hollywood's humanitarian, Martha Simmons' cafe meltdown. The video was everywhere. Every major news outlet had picked it up. Martha watched herself in horror. The entitled sneer, the coffee flying through the air, Grace's shocked expression. The comments beneath the articles were worse. Can't believe I looked up to her all these years. So much for the golden heart, more like stone cold. Her charitable work was clearly just for show. With shaking fingers, Martha dialed her closest friend, actress Catherine Brooks. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried another friend, then another. Each attempt met with silence or brief, uncomfortable conversations. I'm sorry, Martha, but I can't be associated with this right now, said one longtime friend. My brand is all about kindness and inclusion. You understand, don't you? Her phone buzzed again. A message from the Children's Hope Foundation, where she served as honorary chairperson. In light of recent events, we regret to inform you that your services will no longer be required. More messages poured in. The luxury brands she endorsed were suspending their contracts. Upcoming speaking engagements were being canceled. Her social media feeds were flooded with angry comments from disappointed fans. Martha sank into her plush armchair, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather armrests. The carefully constructed image she'd built over decades was crumbling before her eyes. Her phone buzzed again. Janet, her publicist for the 20th time. Martha, finally! Janet's voice was tense. We need to get ahead of this. The damage to your reputation. It was just coffee, Martha snapped, her voice breaking. Don't these people have anything better to do? Martha, listen to me. This isn't just about coffee. People are seeing a side of you that... Janet paused. That doesn't match who they thought you were. Martha ended the call abruptly, unable to bear hearing more. She scrolled through her contact list, desperate to find someone, anyone, who would stand by her. But one by one, calls went unanswered. Messages unread as her social circle rapidly distanced themselves from the unfolding scandal. Martha paced her living room, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. After hours of watching her reputation crumble, she finally called Janet back. "We need to release a statement," Martha said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Something to make this go away." Janet sighed on the other end of the line. "I've drafted something. Let me read it to you. I deeply regret that my actions have caused distress. As someone who has always championed kindness, I acknowledge that yesterday's incident was unfortunate. While there were various factors that contributed to this regrettable situation, I understand that my behavior did not reflect the values I represent." "No." Martha nodded, running her fingers through her perfectly styled hair. "Yes, that sounds good. Professional. Send it out." Within minutes of the statement's release, social media erupted again. The carefully worded apology only seemed to fuel the public's anger. Unfortunate incident? She assaulted someone. Various factors. Just say you're sorry. She can't even take responsibility for her own actions. The Children's Hope Foundation issued their own statement. In light of Ms. Simmons' actions and subsequent response, we are severing all ties effective immediately. Our mission of compassion cannot be associated with someone who demonstrates such behavior. More dominoes began to fall. Luxury brands pulled their endorsement deals. Her upcoming movie role was recast. Fan clubs shut down their websites. The press was relentless, dissecting her statement word by word, pointing out its calculated nature and lack of genuine remorse. "Your statement made things worse," Janet said in their follow-up call. "People are calling it a non-apology apology. The morning shows are having a field day with this." Martha collapsed onto her sofa, clutching a silk throw pillow. "But I said I regretted it. What more do they want?" "Martha, you threw hot coffee at a waitress and then released a statement that basically blamed various factors instead of taking responsibility. People aren't buying the golden heart image anymore." As if to prove Janet's point, Martha's phone buzzed with a notification. The Humanitarian Arts Council, where she'd served as a board member for 15 years, had just announced her removal. Their statement was brutal in its simplicity. "Our organization cannot maintain ties with individuals whose actions directly contradict our core values of dignity and respect for all." The backlash was complete. In less than 48 hours, Martha Simmons, Hollywood's golden heart, had become a symbol of entitled celebrity behavior. Her carefully crafted image of compassion and generosity built over decades had shattered like fine china on a marble floor. Grace sat on her small apartment's worn couch, gently dabbing ointment on the angry red marks that covered her arm. The burns weren't severe, but they still stung, a constant reminder of that horrible morning at the cafe. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears as the scene replayed in her mind. The shocked silence, the burning sensation, the humiliation. Her phone buzzed again. It hadn't stopped since the incident went viral. This time it was a message from her sister, Rachel. "Have you seen how many people are standing up for you? You're trending for all the right reasons, sis." Grace opened her social media account, something she rarely did, and was overwhelmed by the flood of supportive messages. Local community groups had shared her story, and strangers were offering words of encouragement. Grace showed such dignity in the face of cruelty. "This woman represents the best of our community. Let's show Grace what real kindness looks like." Someone had even started a GoFundMe page for her medical expenses. The total was already over $5,000, far more than she needed for the minor burns. Grace's eyes welled up, but this time with gratitude. Her phone rang. It was Maria, her best friend since high school. "Girl, this is your moment," Maria said warmly. "Remember how you always talked about wanting to make a difference? About starting that community center for at-risk youth?" Grace shifted on the couch. "Maria, I don't know. Listen to me. People are inspired by how you handled yourself. You showed real grace, pun intended. You could use this attention to do something good, something meaningful." As if to confirm Maria's words, Grace's phone pinged with another notification. The local newspaper wanted to interview her about workplace dignity and respect. They mentioned featuring her story as part of a larger piece about community resilience. Her pastor had called earlier. reminding her that sometimes life's hardest moments could lead to unexpected blessings. "You've always had a gift for touching people's hearts," he'd said. "Maybe this is your chance to reach even more people." Grace looked at the burns on her arm again, but this time she saw them differently. They weren't just marks of humiliation anymore. They were becoming something else. A reminder that even in our worst moments, community and kindness could heal the deepest wounds. Her neighbor, Mrs. Simpson, had brought over a homemade pie, saying, "You've always been there for others, Grace. Now it's our turn to be there for you." The elderly woman had squeezed her hand and added, "You could do so much good with all this support. People need to hear your story." As Grace sat surrounded by messages of love and encouragement, she felt something shift inside her. The hurt was still there, but it was being transformed by the overwhelming wave of support from her community. Perhaps her friends were right. Maybe this wasn't just an ending, but a beginning of something meaningful. Martha stared at the empty side of the king-sized bed where her husband David usually slept. His closet was half empty now, his favorite suits and shoes gone. The silence in their Beverly Hills mansion felt deafening. "I just need some time," he had said earlier that day, refusing to meet her eyes as he packed his bags. "This scandal, it's affecting my business relationships. My clients are uncomfortable. I think we should take a break until things settle down." Martha's hands trembled as she picked up her phone. 20 missed calls from her publicist, but none from her friends. She scrolled through her contacts and pressed her sister Susan's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail again. "Susan, please," Martha whispered into the phone, her voice cracking. "I know you're there. I need to talk to someone." No response came. Even her own sister was ghosting her. Martha remembered their last conversation, how Susan had spoken with disappointment heavy in her voice. "Do you realize what you've done? Mom and Dad raised us better than this. I can't even tell my kids what their aunt did." Her phone buzzed. Finally, a response. But it was just another notification about a charity organization publicly cutting ties with her. The Childhood Cancer Foundation, where she'd been a spokesperson for 5 years, had released a statement distancing themselves from her inexcusable behavior. Martha walked to her home office, where a wall of framed photos showed her with various celebrities and dignitaries at charity galas. Her Golden Heart legacy, built over decades, now felt like a mockery. She noticed a photo of her with her best friend Linda at last year's Christmas party. Martha picked up her phone again and dialed Linda's number. "The number you have reached is not accepting calls at this time," came the automated response. Tears rolled down Martha's cheeks as she remembered Linda's text from yesterday. "I can't be associated with this kind of behavior. Please don't contact me for a while." The house phone rang and Martha rushed to answer it, hope fluttering in her chest. But it was only her agent, calling to inform her that 2 more upcoming projects had dropped her from consideration. "I've been your agent for 15 years, he said, his voice tired. "But Martha, I don't know how to fix this. You're toxic right now. Nobody wants to work with you." As evening fell, Martha sat alone in her kitchen, the same way she had for the past 3 nights. No dinner invitations from friends, no calls from family, no warm embrace from her husband. The woman who once had to decline social invitations because her calendar was too full now faced nothing but empty hours stretching before her. She picked up a framed photo of her and David from their anniversary celebration just 2 months ago. They looked so happy, surrounded by friends and family. Now those same people couldn't distance themselves fast enough from her disgrace. Grace sat at her small kitchen table, overwhelmed by the flood of supportive messages on her phone. Her arm still showed faint marks from the coffee burns, but the emotional warmth from strangers had become a different kind of healing. "Look at this one, Mama," she said to her mother, who had come over to check on her. "This lady from Minnesota sent me $100 and the sweetest note about how she worked as a waitress for 30 years. Her mother squeezed her shoulder gently. "People can see your heart, baby. They know you didn't deserve what happened." Grace scrolled through more messages. There were hundreds now. Some shared their own stories of workplace humiliation, others offered words of encouragement, and many praised her dignity in the face of cruelty. One message in particular caught her eye. "Mama, listen to this," Grace said, her voice soft with emotion. "Dear Grace, I've been a housekeeper for 20 years, and I know how it feels when people treat you like you're invisible. Your story touched my heart. We need more places where working women can find support and understanding." Grace put down her phone, her eyes growing distant as something stirred in her mind. "You know, all these messages got me thinking. What if there was a place where women like us could come together? Not just waitresses, but all women working hard jobs for little pay?" Her mother pulled up a chair, interested. "What kind of place?" "A community center," Grace said, her eyes brightening. "Somewhere women could find resources, maybe get career advice, or just have someone to talk to who understands their struggles. We could offer support groups, maybe even classes." As she spoke, the idea took shape in her mind, becoming clearer and more real. "Think about it, Mama. All these women sending me support, they're showing there's a real need for this. We could help women who've faced discrimination or who just need a helping hand to reach their dreams." Grace stood up and walked to her small living room window, looking out at her neighborhood. "Everyone's been so kind to me. Maybe this is my chance to pay it forward, to turn what happened into something good." Her mother joined her at the window. "You've always had a big heart, Grace. Even as a little girl, you were always thinking about how to help others." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or hurt anymore. For the first time since the incident, she felt truly hopeful. The community center wasn't just a dream, it was becoming a mission, something that could give meaning to everything she'd been through. "I think I need to start making some calls," Grace said, reaching for her notebook. "There's got to be people out there who'd want to help make this happen." Next day, Martha stared at her phone, her manicured fingers trembling as she scrolled through the endless stream of negative comments. Her carefully crafted apology video, which she'd spent hours perfecting with her publicist, had completely backfired. "She's just sorry she got caught," one comment read. "Look at her perfect makeup and designer outfit while she apologizes. So, out of touch. The golden heart is actually made of stone." Martha sank deeper into her plush living room sofa, feeling the walls of her mansion closing in around her. The house felt emptier now that her husband had moved out temporarily. Even her housekeeper had quit, saying she couldn't work for someone like that. Her phone rang. It was her agent. With shaking hands, she answered. "Martha, I'm sorry, but the network is pulling your Christmas special," he said, his voice heavy. "And the cosmetics company. They're terminating your contract." "But I apologized," Martha's voice cracked. "I did exactly what the PR team said. I looked remorseful. I used all the right words." "That's the problem, Martha. People can tell it was scripted. They're saying you care more about your image than actually making things right." After hanging up, Martha walked to her bathroom and stared at her reflection. The woman who looked back at her seemed suddenly older, more vulnerable. She'd spent decades building her reputation as Hollywood's golden heart, carefully crafting every public appearance, every charitable donation, every red carpet smile. Now it was crumbling before her eyes. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. Someone had dug up an old video of her berating a parking attendant years ago. The comments were brutal. "See? This is who she really is. The mask has finally slipped." Martha's legs gave out and she slid down against the bathroom wall. For the first time since the cafe incident, she felt truly alone. Her sophisticated PR strategy, her wealth, her connections, none of it could shield her from the truth about herself that everyone now saw so clearly. The charity foundation she'd established was distancing itself from her. Former friends weren't returning her calls. Even her sister had texted to say she needed space. The careful facade she'd built over the years had shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. As she sat there on her bathroom floor, still wearing the designer outfit she'd chosen for her apology video, Martha realized that all the money and fame in the world couldn't buy back what she'd lost. The public had seen behind the curtain, and they weren't willing to forget what they'd found there. Martha's phone buzzed with another devastating email. The Children's Hospital was removing her name from their wing, the one she'd helped fund just 2 years ago. Her hands trembled as she read the carefully worded message about upholding their values and protecting their reputation. She switched on the TV only to see her face plastered across Entertainment Tonight. The host was interviewing a former assistant who painted a picture of Martha as a demanding diva, who regularly berated staff. Old photos and clips surfaced, showing moments when her mask had slipped. A rolled eye here, a dismissive wave there. Sources close to the actress say this behavior has been going on for years, the host announced. The cafe incident was just the tip of the iceberg. Martha's publicist, Janet, called with more bad news. The cosmetics line is pulling your products from shelves, she said, her voice distant and professional. And Martha, I think we need to discuss our working relationship. What do you mean? Her voice came out small, nothing like her usual confident tone. I've built my career representing clients who maintain certain standards. This situation, it's becoming impossible to manage. Even Janet, who'd stood by her through minor scandals and dips in popularity, was jumping ship. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Later that afternoon, Martha watched from behind her living room curtains as reporters camped outside her gate. They shouted questions whenever anyone entered or left. Martha, how do you respond to allegations of workplace bullying? Is it true you're being dropped by your talent agency? Her phone lit up with a text from her agent. Meeting canceled. Network's going with someone else for the lead role. The role she'd been counting on, her comeback vehicle, gone just like that. Martha sank onto her sofa, surrounded by magazines with her face on the cover, all asking variations of the same question. Who is the real Martha Simmons? She picked up one magazine and stared at her own image. The headline read, Golden Heart or Fool's Gold. The Fall of Hollywood's Beloved Icon. The article detailed every charitable event she'd attended, questioning her motives. Every donation she'd made was scrutinized. Even her smile in old photos was analyzed for signs of insincerity. Her agent texted again, maybe lay low for a while, take some time off, let this blow over. But Martha knew better. In Hollywood, taking time off was code for, your career is over. She'd seen it happen to others, never imagining she'd face the same fate. Now, watching her empire crumble, she realized just how fragile it had all been. Grace sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks filled with her neat handwriting. Her arm still bore the faint marks from the coffee incident, but her heart was full of hope. She'd spent the evening jotting down ideas for the community center, and the pages were alive with possibilities. Support groups for service workers, she murmured, running her finger down the list. Job training workshops, childcare assistance. Each item represented something she wished she'd had access to during her toughest times. Her phone chimed with another donation notification. She picked it up, her eyes welling with tears at the message attached. You showed such dignity in that moment. Let us help you help others. The donation counter on her GoFundMe page had reached $50,000, far beyond what she'd ever imagined possible. Lisa, her friend from the cafe, had connected her with a local real estate agent who specialized in community properties. There's this old community hall on Oak Street, Lisa had told her. It needs work, but the bones are good, and the price is right. Grace reached for another notebook, this one filled with contact information for local organizations willing to partner with her initiative. The domestic violence shelter had offered counseling services. The community college wanted to provide free classes. Even the mayor's office had called, expressing interest in supporting her vision. Her sister Rachel walked in, carrying 2 cups of tea. Another donation just came in, she said, setting 1 cup down. That nice family from church? They're offering to help with the renovations once we find a building. Grace smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. For years, she'd worked hard just to get by, never imagining she could make a bigger difference. Now, surrounded by support and possibility, she felt like she could move mountains. She opened her laptop to find more messages of encouragement flooding her inbox. A local business owner offered to sponsor monthly workshops. A retired teacher volunteered to teach literacy classes. Each message reinforced what Grace was beginning to understand. She wasn't just creating a building, she was building a community. You know what? Rachel said, looking at her sister's glowing face. I've never seen you like this before. You're different. Grace nodded, understanding exactly what her sister meant. The incident that could have broken her spirit had instead awakened something powerful within her. She felt stronger, more purposeful, more alive than ever before. She picked up her pen again, adding another item to her growing list: Emergency Assistance Fund for Workers in Crisis. The words flowed easily now, each one a step toward making her dream a reality. The community center wasn't just a response to what had happened to her. It was becoming her life's mission, a way to transform pain into purpose. Martha stood at her living room window, staring at the sprawling Beverly Hills vista that now felt more like a gilded cage than a symbol of success. Her perfectly manicured lawn seemed to mock the mess her life had become. The morning paper lay on her marble coffee table, its headlines screaming about Grace's latest achievement, the successful fundraising campaign for her community center. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her contact list for the 100th time. Names that once represented power, influence, and friendship now only reminded her of rejection. She pressed Sandra's number, her closest friend of 15 years, and waited as it rang. "The number you have dialed is not accepting calls at this time," came the automated response. Martha's hand trembled as she lowered the phone. Her agent had dropped her last week. "I'm sorry, Martha," he'd said, not sounding sorry at all. "But I have to think about my other clients. Your situation? It's complicated." The house felt enormous and empty. Her husband hadn't been home in weeks, claiming he needed space to think. The staff had quietly resigned one by one, citing various excuses. Even her favorite charity, the Children's Hospital where she'd been a board member for a decade, had asked her to step down. Martha walked to her home office where a wall of framed magazine covers once celebrated her success. Now they seemed to taunt her with images of who she used to be. Hollywood's golden heart, America's sweetheart, the star who gives back. She touched one frame, remembering the day it was shot. The photographer had praised her genuine smile, not knowing how practiced it was. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Another article about Grace, describing how her community center project was inspiring similar initiatives across the country. The comments below were brutal. "This is what a real golden heart looks like. And see the difference between fake charity and genuine kindness?" Martha sank into her leather chair, the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She'd tried calling her publicist earlier, hoping to arrange some positive press coverage, maybe even a donation to Grace's project. But even he wouldn't take her calls anymore. The silence in the house was deafening. No ringing phones, no assistants rushing in with schedules, no friends dropping by for lunch. Just Martha, alone with the consequences of her actions, watching another woman rise from the ashes of her cruelty to become everything Martha had only pretended to be. She opened her laptop, typing out another email to her former best friend. "Caroline, please, I just need someone to talk to." Her finger hovered over the send button, but she already knew what would happen. Either no response or another polite but firm rejection. She closed the laptop without sending it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her expensive furniture, highlighting the emptiness of her vast home. Martha had everything money could buy, but she'd never felt poorer. Next day, Martha's hands shook as she adjusted the microphone stand in the small hotel conference room. The space, meant to hold 200 people, felt cavernous with only 23 attendees scattered across the rows of chairs. Most were journalists, their pens poised and cameras ready, hungry for another story about her downfall. She smoothed her designer dress, chosen carefully to appear humble yet put together, and cleared her throat. The sound echoed through the nearly empty room, making her wince. Just 6 months ago, she could fill stadiums. Now she couldn't even fill a hotel conference room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I've called this press conference because I want to address my actions at the Morning Light Cafe directly and personally." A journalist in the front row yawned openly. Another checked his phone, clearly bored. Martha felt her chest tighten as she continued with her carefully rehearsed speech. "What I did that day was inexcusable," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I let my privilege and ego control my actions, and I hurt someone who was simply trying to do her job." A few cameras clicked, but the faces behind them remained skeptical. One reporter whispered to another, both smirking. Martha could practically see the headlines they were already crafting in their minds. "I understand now that my previous apologies seemed insincere," she pressed on, her throat growing tight. "I hoped that by speaking directly to you all today—" "Too late for that, isn't it?" someone called from the back. A few others nodded in agreement. Martha's carefully prepared words began to crumble. She looked down at her notes, the letters swimming before her eyes. The room felt suffocating, the few faces before her morphing into a wall of judgment and dismissal. She struggled to continue. "I want to make things right." "Maybe you should have thought of that before throwing coffee at an innocent woman," another voice called out. Several people stood up and began gathering their things, clearly having heard enough. Martha watched helplessly as one by one people filed out of the room. A young reporter paused at the door, giving her a pitying look before leaving. Within minutes, only 3 people remained, all typing rapidly on their phones, no doubt sharing details of her failed attempt at redemption. She stepped away from the microphone, her designer heels clicking against the floor in the painful silence. Her publicist, standing in the corner, wouldn't meet her eyes. This had been her last chance, her final attempt to salvage something of her former life, and it had failed spectacularly. Gathering her purse with trembling hands, Martha hurried toward the exit, keeping her head down to hide the tears threatening to fall. The weight of her complete social isolation had never felt heavier than in this moment, as she walked alone through the empty hotel corridor. The following day, Martha sat alone in her sprawling Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by luxury, but feeling emptier than ever. The house, usually filled with the bustle of staff and the chatter of celebrity friends, now echoed with silence. Even her housekeeper of 15 years had quietly resigned last week. She wandered into her home theater, where shelves of awards gleamed in the dim light. Each golden statue, once a symbol of her success, now seemed to mock her. Martha picked up one of her humanitarian awards, reading the inscription that praised her golden heart. The irony made her stomach turn. Sinking into one of the plush theater seats, Martha buried her face in her hands. "What have I become?" she whispered to the empty room. Memories flooded her mind, the countless interviews where she'd spoken about kindness and charity, all while treating people behind the scenes with contempt. The image of Grace's shocked face as the coffee splashed across her uniform haunted her. Martha's phone lay silent on the armrest. No calls, no messages, no emails, except from her lawyers. The crushing loneliness pressed in around her like a physical weight. She thought about her husband, who'd moved out 3 weeks ago, and the friends who'd disappeared one by one. Standing up abruptly, Martha walked to her bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired, stripped of the usual perfect makeup and designer clothes. For the first time in years, she really saw herself. Not the carefully crafted image of Martha Simmons, Hollywood's golden heart, but just Martha, a woman who'd lost her way. "I need to make this right," she whispered to her reflection. "Not for the cameras, not for my image, for me." With trembling hands, Martha picked up her phone and searched for the Morning Light Cafe's number. She knew Grace would be there. She'd seen news coverage of the waitress still showing up for her shifts despite all the attention. Martha's finger hovered over the call button as doubt crept in. What right did she have to contact Grace after what she'd done? But something had changed inside her. This wasn't about salvaging her career or winning back public approval. For the first time in decades, Martha felt a genuine need to acknowledge her wrongs and face the consequences of her actions. Taking a deep breath, Martha pressed the call button. As the phone rang, her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wasn't calling as Martha Simmons the star, but as Martha the person. Someone who needed to make amends not for the world to see, but because it was right. "Morning Light Cafe," a voice answered. "How can I help you?" Martha's voice shook as she spoke. "Hello, I'd like to speak with Grace Daniels, please. This is Martha Simmons." Then, next quiet morning. The Morning Light Cafe was quiet with only a few regulars lingering over coffee. Grace sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, waiting. When Martha walked in, She looked different from the glamorous star who'd stormed through these doors weeks ago. Her face was bare of makeup, and she wore simple jeans and a sweater. Martha's steps were hesitant as she approached the table. Gone was the entitled swagger that had defined her public persona for so long. Her eyes met Grace's briefly before dropping to the floor. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Martha said softly, sliding into the seat across from Grace. Grace nodded, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Would you like some coffee?" Martha shook her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't deserve your kindness, Grace. What I did to you..." Her voice cracked. "There's no excuse for it." Grace watched as tears welled up in Martha's eyes. The actress who had once commanded every room she entered now seemed small and vulnerable. "I've spent weeks thinking about who I've become," Martha continued, her voice trembling. "All these years I convinced myself that my public image was who I really was, but I was cruel and entitled, treating people like they were beneath me." She wiped at her eyes with shaking hands. "I'm so deeply sorry, Grace. Not just for throwing the coffee, but for treating you like you didn't matter." Grace's expression softened slightly, but she remained quiet, letting Martha continue. "I've lost everything, my marriage, my friends, my career. But sitting alone in my empty house, I realized the worst thing I lost was my humanity." Martha met Grace's eyes directly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I see now how wrong I was, how far I'd strayed from the person I should have been." Grace took a slow sip of her coffee, studying the broken woman before her. The sincerity in Martha's words was unmistakable, but years of experience had taught her to be cautious. "I appreciate you coming here, Martha," Grace said carefully. "And I can see you're hurting. But understanding what you did wrong and actually changing are two different things." Martha nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. I have so much work to do on myself. I needed to start somewhere real, not with press releases or public statements, just person to person facing what I did." Grace's heart softened further at Martha's vulnerability, but she maintained her gentle reserve. The woman before her seemed genuinely remorseful, but true redemption would require more than tears and apologies. Grace took a deep breath, her hands still wrapped around her coffee mug. "Martha, I can forgive you, but forgiveness isn't the end of your journey. It's just the beginning." Martha looked up, her tear-stained face showing a glimmer of hope. "Real change," Grace continued gently, "comes from what you do after someone forgives you. It's about the choices you make every single day, especially when no one's watching." Martha nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted quietly. "Start with yourself," Grace said, her voice warm but firm. "Not your image, not what others think of you, but who you really are inside. Find that person again, the one who got lost somewhere along the way." Martha's shoulders slumped as the weight of Grace's words settled over her. "I've spent so long being what everyone expected me to be. I'm not sure I even know who I am anymore." "Then that's your first step," Grace replied. "Figure out who Martha really is, without all the glamour and spotlight." She leaned forward slightly. "And remember, redemption isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about becoming someone better than you were before." Martha dabbed at her eyes again, nodding slowly. The wisdom in Grace's words touched something deep inside her. She stood up, her movements uncertain but her eyes showing a new determination. "Thank you, Grace," she said softly, "for giving me a chance I probably don't deserve." "Everyone deserves a chance to change," Grace responded. "What matters is what you do with it." Martha gathered her purse, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter from Grace's forgiveness, but weighed down by the responsibility of proving herself worthy of it. As she walked toward the cafe door, her steps were slow but purposeful, her mind already turning to the long road ahead. After a few days, Grace stood at the front of the small office space, pointing to a blueprint spread across a folding table. "If we knock down this wall, we can make the main gathering area twice as big," she explained to her small team of volunteers. Among them stood Martha, wearing simple clothes and her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. She'd been coming to help for 2 weeks now, introducing herself only as Mary and keeping to the background. No one had recognized her yet. Amazing what a difference no makeup and humble clothing could make. Martha carefully arranged folders containing donor information, listening to Grace's passionate plans for the community center. The work was simple: filing papers, answering phones, organizing supplies. But it filled her with an unfamiliar warmth. Here, no one expected anything from her except honest effort. "Could you help stock the supply closet?" Grace asked, her smile genuine and kind. Martha nodded, gathering boxes of donated office supplies. As she arranged pens, papers, and staplers on metal shelves, she thought about how different this felt from her old charity galas. There, everything had been about being seen, about maintaining her image. But here, in this tiny back room that no one would ever photograph, she felt truly useful for the first time. "Need any help?" Another volunteer poked her head in, and Martha smiled, shaking her head. "I've got it, thanks," she replied softly, carefully arranging folders by color. The simple task brought her a peace she'd never found in all her years of red carpet appearances. Later that afternoon, Martha helped serve coffee to a group of women attending a job skills workshop. As she watched them take notes and support each other, she felt a lump in her throat. These women weren't here for show or publicity. They were here to build better lives. "Mary's been such a blessing," she overheard Grace telling another volunteer. "So humble and hardworking, never complains about any task, no matter how small." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes as she wiped down tables. All those years she'd thought being important meant having her name in lights. But here, anonymous and serving others, she finally felt like she mattered. Martha sat in her small apartment that evening, staring at her reflection in a dusty mirror. The space was nothing like her former mansion, but it was all she could afford now after most of her contracts had been canceled. Her fingers traced the laugh lines around her eyes, lines she used to hate, lines that expensive creams had promised to erase. "What have I become?" she whispered to herself. The question haunted her daily, especially when she scrolled through old photos on her phone. Images of red carpets, designer gowns, and adoring fans felt like memories from someone else's life. Her phone buzzed, another rejection email from a potential employer. Even with her new outlook on life, the constant reminders of her past mistakes weighed heavily on her heart. She'd tried applying for regular jobs, but her notorious incident with Grace always seemed to surface during background checks. The next morning at the community center, Martha watched Grace lead a motivation session for struggling single mothers. Grace's natural warmth filled the room, drawing smiles and hope from women who looked as lost as Martha felt. It struck her then. She'd spent decades pretending to be inspirational, while Grace actually was. "Martha," Grace called out after the session, "would you mind helping these ladies with their resume formatting?" Martha nodded, sitting down with 3 women who reminded her of herself before fame, young, uncertain, but full of determination. As she helped them highlight their skills and experiences, she found herself sharing practical advice about confidence and self-presentation. For once, her years in the spotlight offered something genuinely valuable to others. "You're really good at this," one of the women said, smiling at her revised resume. "It's like you know exactly how to make people sound their best." Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest, not the familiar rush of pride she used to get from praise, but something deeper and more authentic. She was using her experience to truly help someone else, not just for show or cameras. Later, organizing donations in the back room, Martha found herself crying quietly. The tears weren't from self-pity this time, but from a mix of regret and gratitude. She regretted the years wasted on superficial pursuits, yet felt grateful for this chance to discover what real service meant. Grace found her there, quickly offering a tissue. "Everyone has moments when it gets overwhelming," she said softly, not pressing for details. Martha wiped her eyes. "I keep thinking about how much time I wasted pretending to be something I wasn't." "The past is past," Grace replied, her voice gentle but firm. "What matters is what you're doing now, one day at a time. Martha scrolled through her social media feed, her heart heavy as she read the latest comments. Even months after the incident, people still posted cruel remarks and reminders of her coffee shop outburst. A recent attempt to audition for a small theater production had ended with the director politely but firmly showing her the door. "We just can't risk the negative publicity," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. She closed her laptop and looked around her modest apartment. The walls were bare now. She'd sold most of her awards and memorabilia to cover expenses. Only one small photo remained, a candid shot of her helping a young woman practice for a job interview at Grace's community center. Yesterday, one of them had hugged her tightly after landing her first office position. "I couldn't have done it without your help," the woman had said. The joy Martha felt in that moment was pure, untainted by cameras or public perception. As she prepared for another day at the center, Martha caught herself checking her appearance in the mirror, an old habit from her celebrity days. But now, instead of scrutinizing every flaw, she simply made sure she looked presentable and professional for the women she'd be helping. "Maybe this is what I was meant to do all along," she whispered to herself, straightening her simple blouse. The thought brought an unexpected peace. Her designer clothes and red carpet gowns had never made her feel as worthy as the simple thank you from someone she'd truly helped. At the center that afternoon, Martha overheard two women discussing her past. "Can you believe that's the same person from that horrible video?" one whispered. "People can change," the other replied softly. "Look at all she does here." Martha felt her cheeks flush, but not from shame this time. These women saw her, not the manufactured golden heart of Hollywood, but the real person she was becoming. Their simple acceptance meant more than any standing ovation she'd ever received. Martha sat on her small balcony, sipping tea from a chipped mug, so different from the fine china she once insisted upon. The morning sun warmed her face as she watched people hurrying to work on the street below. A year ago, she would have considered this view beneath her. Now she found beauty in its simplicity. Looking around her modest two-bedroom apartment, Martha noticed how the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air. The space was small, but cozy, filled with second-hand furniture she'd carefully selected. No more marble countertops or crystal chandeliers, no more housekeepers or personal assistants. Just her, living honestly for the first time in decades. She thought about yesterday at the community center, where she'd helped a young mother practice her typing skills. The woman's genuine smile of accomplishment had filled Martha with a warmth that no red carpet moment had ever matched. "I used to think I needed designer labels to feel worthy," she murmured to herself, running her fingers over the worn fabric of her favorite sweater from the thrift store. How empty it all was. Her gaze fell on a stack of old magazines in the corner, their covers featuring her former self. Perfectly posed, expertly styled, completely artificial. The woman in those glossy photos felt like a stranger now. Martha remembered the exhausting effort it took to maintain that image, the constant fear of showing any flaw. These days, her mistakes were visible to everyone, but instead of hiding them, she was learning from them. The harsh lessons of her public fall had stripped away her pretenses, leaving something real and vulnerable underneath. It wasn't always comfortable, but it felt honest in a way her previous life never had. She picked up her day planner, no longer filled with celebrity appearances and photo shoots, but with volunteer shifts and coffee dates with the women from the center. Each simple entry represented a chance to make a genuine difference in someone's life, not just pose for cameras and receive hollow praise. The regrets still came, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep. Memories of her cruel behavior, especially toward Grace, would flood back. But even these moments had their purpose, reminding her of how far she'd come and how much further she still needed to go. Martha stood up, carrying her empty mug to the kitchen sink. She had to get ready for her shift at the center. As she washed the few dishes from breakfast, she smiled at how such ordinary tasks had become almost meditative. In the quiet moments of her new life, she was finally finding peace. Martha walked slowly through the community center's hallway, her footsteps echoing against the worn linoleum floor. The walls were lined with colorful artwork from the children's program, and she paused to study a crayon drawing of what looked like a rainbow-colored tree. Such simple beauty had once seemed beneath her notice. She watched through the window as Grace led a group discussion in the main room, her warm presence drawing people in just as it always had. The sight no longer filled Martha with shame, but rather with a quiet appreciation for how life's hardest moments could lead to unexpected growth. "You know," a gentle voice spoke behind her, "you've really changed." It was Mrs. Chen, one of the regular volunteers who had initially been skeptical of Martha's presence at the center. Martha offered a small smile, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. "I'm trying," she said softly. "Some days are harder than others." "That's what makes it real," Mrs. Chen replied, patting her arm before continuing down the hallway. Later that evening, Martha sat in her modest living room, looking through the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Her phone lay silent on the coffee table. No calls from agents, no messages from producers, no invitations to glamorous events. The silence that had once felt like punishment now felt like freedom. She thought about the long road ahead. True redemption wouldn't come from grand gestures or public statements. It would come from these small moments, these quiet choices to be better than she was yesterday. She might never win back her fame or fortune, might never see her name in lights again, but for the first time in her life, Martha felt like she was playing a role that mattered, the role of herself, imperfect but growing. Opening her journal, Martha began to write about her day, not for publicity or posterity, but for herself, a simple record of her journey toward becoming the person she should have been all along. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was learning to find peace in that uncertainty, one small step at a time. If you enjoyed the story of Martha and Grace, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.